Chapter 1. The Quiet Drain. You're tired, but not in a way that sleep fixes. You wake up already heavy, as if the day has started without your permission. Your body functions, your mind works, you do what needs to be done. Yet somewhere underneath, there is a constant background exhaustion. Not dramatic, not acute, just steady and dull. You tell yourself you are lazy, ungrateful, undisciplined, maybe even broken. But the tiredness does not come from doing too much. It comes from carrying something invisible all the time. It comes from living in comparison mode. Most people don't notice when it starts. There is no clear moment, no decision. You don't wake up one day and choose to compare yourself to others. It slips in quietly, disguised as awareness, inspiration, motivation, realism. You look around and register how others are doing. You scroll, observe, listen, absorb. Someone your age is further ahead. Someone with fewer responsibilities is moving faster. Someone younger seems calmer, richer, more confident. Someone older seems more established, more secure. You don't even think about it consciously at first. Your mind simply notes the differences. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those observations turn into measurements, and those measurements turn into judgments. And once judgment enters the system, energy begins to leak. Comparison is mentally expensive. Every time you measure yourself against someone else, your brain performs a complex calculation. It gathers fragments of information about another person's life, filters them through assumptions, removes context, exaggerates outcomes, and then places you on the same imaginary scale. This process happens dozens, sometimes hundreds of times a day. You rarely notice it because it feels like thinking, but it is not neutral thinking. It is evaluative thinking. And evaluative thinking keeps the nervous system slightly activated all the time. You're not in danger, but your body doesn't fully relax either. Over time, this low-grade tension becomes exhaustion. The most damaging part is that comparison creates the illusion that there is a correct pace, a correct level, a correct version of life you're supposed to be at by now. Once that illusion settles in, everything you do is filtered through it. Your achievements feel small. Your progress feels slow. Your rest feels undeserved. Even moments of joy are interrupted by a quiet thought. Others are doing more. This is why people who constantly compare themselves often feel tired even during periods of relative calm. Their minds never stop scanning, evaluating, ranking. Self-comparison is not loud. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up as mild dissatisfaction, as a sense of being behind, as a subtle pressure to catch up. You can be functioning well on the surface and still feel internally depleted. You might be productive, responsible, capable, yet emotionally flat. That flatness is not a lack of ambition. It is a symptom of chronic self-evaluation. One of the reasons comparison is so draining is that it is structurally unwinnable. No matter where you are, there will always be someone who appears to be ahead in at least one area. If you compare income, someone earns more. If you compare freedom, someone has fewer obligations. If you compare discipline, someone seems more consistent. If you compare peace of mind, someone looks calmer. The mind, once trained to compare, will always find a reference point that puts you at a disadvantage. This is not because you are failing, but because the comparison system itself is biased against you. Your brain does not compare full realities. It compares highlights to behind-the-scenes footage. You see other people's outcomes, not their internal costs. You see their visible results, not their invisible trade-offs. You compare your tired, complex, emotionally layered inner world with a simplified external image of someone else's life. The result is predictable. You feel insufficient. And when a human being feels insufficient for too long, their energy drops, motivation weakens, action feels heavier. Everything takes more effort. Over time, comparison reshapes your internal dialogue. Instead of asking, "What do I need right now?" you ask, "Why am I not like them?" Instead of, what is my next step? You think, I should be further. Instead of, this is hard but manageable. You think, others handle more. Why can't I? These questions are not neutral. They carry accusation. An accusation, even when self-directed, triggers resistance. A system under constant self-criticism does not move forward smoothly. It either slows down or shuts down. This is why comparison often leads not to improvement, but to paralysis. On the surface, it looks like you want to grow. Underneath, your nervous system interprets constant negative evaluation as threat. When the system feels threatened, it conserves energy. It delays action. It avoids exposure. It chooses safety over movement. You experience this as procrastination, indecision, or emotional numbness. But at its core, it is fatigue caused by living under continuous internal judgment. Another hidden cost of self-comparison is that it fragments attention. Part of your mental energy is always allocated to monitoring where you stand relative to others. Even while working, resting, or spending time with family, a portion of your awareness is elsewhere, running background checks on your own worth. This constant split drains cognitive resources. You feel scattered, unfocused, easily overwhelmed. Not because you lack capacity, but because your capacity is being quietly taxed. People often try to fix this exhaustion by pushing harder. More discipline, more goals, more self-improvement. But this approach misses the root cause. If the exhaustion came from lack of effort, effort would solve it. But exhaustion from comparison does not respond to pressure. Pressure increases the internal noise. It strengthens the comparison loop. It reinforces the belief that you are behind and must compensate. The system tightens instead of releasing. There's also a specific emotional texture to comparison fatigue. It is not sharp sadness. It is not dramatic despair. It is a muted heaviness, a sense of dull disappointment with yourself. You may still function well, even excel in some areas, but the internal satisfaction is missing. Achievements do not land. Progress does not register. You move the finish line as soon as you approach it, because someone else is always further. This creates a life where movement never turns into arrival, and a life without arrival is exhausting. Many people assume this state is normal. They believe adulthood simply feels like this. That being tired, self-critical, and quietly dissatisfied is the price of responsibility. But this state is not inherent to responsibility. It is a byproduct of measuring yourself against external standards that were never designed for your specific life. When you live on someone else's scale, your system never fully rests. The quiet drain of self-comparison is dangerous, not because it is intense, but because it is sustainable. You can live like this for years. You can build a life, raise children, run businesses, achieve milestones, all while feeling internally depleted. And because there is no clear breakdown, you assume the problem is you. You think you need fixing. In reality, the system you are running on is flawed. This chapter is not meant to motivate you. It is meant to reframe what you are experiencing. If you feel tired in a way that rest does not cure, if you feel behind without a clear reason, if your inner voice is more critical than supportive, there is a strong chance that comparison is quietly draining you. Not because you are weak, but because you are human in an environment that constantly invites measurement. Understanding this is the first relief. Not the solution yet, but the relief of accurate diagnosis. You are not failing at life. You are carrying an unnecessary cognitive load. You are living with an internal scoreboard that never turns off. And no system performs well when it is permanently under review. In the next chapters, we will break down how this scoreboard forms, why it feels so convincing, and how to step out of it without forcing positivity or pretending comparison does not exist. For now, it is enough to recognize the drain for what it is, not laziness, not lack of discipline, not personal deficiency, just energy lost to constant self-measurement. Chapter 2. Comparison is not motivation. Most people believe comparison pushes them forward. They think it creates drive, urgency, momentum. They tell themselves that seeing others succeed lights a fire, that discomfort is necessary, that pressure sharpens performance. This belief is deeply ingrained and rarely questioned. From early education to modern social media, comparison is presented as a normal and even useful tool. Look at others, see what is possible, aim higher. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, but the lived experience tells a different story. If comparison truly worked as motivation, people who compare themselves the most would be the most energized, consistent, and fulfilled. In reality, they are often the most tired, self-critical, and stuck. Comparison can create a short spike of activity. You see someone doing better, and for a moment, something tightens inside you. You feel a push. You might work harder for a day, a week, sometimes even longer. This is why comparison is often mistaken for motivation. It produces movement, but it is not sustainable movement. It is movement powered by threat, not by alignment. And systems powered by threat burn out quickly. The nervous system does not distinguish well between physical danger and social evaluation. When you compare yourself and come up short, even subtly, your body registers it as a form of risk. Not immediate danger, but a signal of potential rejection, inadequacy, or loss of status. This activates stress responses. Cortisol rises slightly. Muscles tense. Attention narrows. For a brief period, this can increase output. You become sharper, more focused, more driven. But this state is not designed to last. It is meant for short bursts, not daily living. When comparison is used repeatedly as a source of drive, the body never fully exits this state. What initially felt like motivation slowly transforms into pressure. Pressure turns into resistance. Resistance turns into fatigue. At that point, people assume the problem is discipline. They try to push through, they add more rules, more goals, more expectations. But what they are actually doing is demanding long-term performance from a system that is already overloaded. Another reason comparison fails as motivation is that it does not provide clear direction. It tells you that you are behind, but it does not tell you what your next appropriate step is. It gives you a vague sense of insufficiency without actionable clarity. You feel the urge to improve, but not a grounded sense of how. This often leads to scattered effort. You try many things, start and stop, change directions frequently. Not because you lack commitment, but because comparison-based motivation lacks structure. It points outward, not inward. There's also a critical psychological difference between being drawn towards something and being pushed away from something. Healthy motivation is attraction-based. It comes from interest, meaning, curiosity, or personal relevance. Comparison-based motivation is avoidance-based. You are not moving toward what you want, but away from what you fear being. Fear of being average. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being judged. Avoidance-based systems require constant energy input. The moment you stop applying pressure, movement stops. Over time, this dynamic erodes self-trust. When your actions are driven by comparison, you stop listening to your own internal signals. You ignore fatigue. You override intuition. You discount your own timing. You begin to believe that whatever pace feels natural to you is wrong, because someone else is moving faster. This creates internal conflict. One part of you pushes forward, another resists. The result is inconsistency, not progress. Many people notice that the things they do out of comparison rarely bring satisfaction even when they succeed. You reach a milestone, but instead of relief, your mind immediately searches for the next benchmark. Someone else is still ahead. Someone else is doing more. The goalpost moves. This is not accidental. Comparison-based systems are designed without a rival. If your sense of worth depends on relative position, there is no stable endpoint. Someone will always be above you in some dimension. This turns life into a treadmill rather than a path. It is important to understand that inspiration and comparison are not the same thing, even though they are often confused. Inspiration expands your sense of possibility. It does not diminish you. When you are inspired, you feel energized without feeling inadequate. Your nervous system remains relatively calm. There is curiosity rather than urgency. Comparison, on the other hand, contracts your sense of self. It frames growth as correction, not exploration. It tells you that who you are now is insufficient and must be fixed quickly. Social media amplifies this confusion. Platforms are designed to highlight outcomes, not processes. You see finished products, achievements, polished versions of life. Your brain absorbs these images without context and treats them as reference points. Over time, your baseline shifts. What once felt impressive now feels normal. What once felt sufficient now feels lacking. This creates a moving standard that is impossible to meet. Trying to motivate yourself against a constantly rising baseline is exhausting. There's also a subtle moral layer to comparison-based motivation. When you believe others are doing better, you often interpret it as evidence that you should be doing more. This turns effort into obligation. Rest becomes guilt. Pauses feel like failure. You stop asking whether something is meaningful or sustainable and focus only on whether it measures up. This moral pressure drains joy from action. Even things you once enjoyed begin to feel heavy. The irony is that comparison often reduces the very performance it is supposed to enhance. When people operate under constant evaluation, they become risk-averse. They choose safer options. They delay starting until conditions feel perfect. They hesitate to share work early. They fear visible mistakes. All of this slows learning and growth. In contrast, people who feel internally secure are more willing to experiment, fail, adjust, and improve. Their progress may look slower at first, but it compounds over time. Another overlooked effect is how comparison distorts perception of effort. You see others' outputs, not their inputs. You assume they are achieving more with less struggle. This makes your own effort feel inefficient and embarrassing. You may be working intensely, but because the comparison frame hides others' struggles, your work feels inadequate. This perception alone can sap motivation. Humans are deeply affected by perceived fairness. When effort feels disproportionately unrewarded, engagement drops. Eventually, comparison-based motivation leads to emotional numbness. The system cannot sustain constant pressure indefinitely. When the nervous system is overstimulated for too long, it protects itself by dampening emotional response. You stop feeling sharp disappointment, but you also stop feeling excitement. Everything becomes flat. This is often mistaken for loss of passion or burnout from doing too much. In reality, it is burnout from being evaluated too often. Understanding that comparison is not motivation is not about rejecting growth or ambition. It is about recognizing the quality of the force driving you. Growth fueled by curiosity feels different from growth fueled by fear. One expands capacity. The other consumes it. One builds resilience. The other relies on pressure until the system collapses or shuts down. If you have relied on comparison for a long time, letting go of it may feel unsettling. Without pressure, you might fear becoming complacent. This fear is understandable but misplaced. Removing comparison does not remove direction. It removes distortion. It allows you to access cleaner signals about what actually matters to you, what pace is sustainable, and what kind of effort produces real momentum. In the next chapter, we will look at how the mind creates an internal scoreboard and why it feels so compelling, even when it is clearly harming you. For now, it is enough to question a belief that many people never examine. If comparison were true motivation, you would feel more alive, not less, more focused, not scattered, more confident, not constantly behind. The fact that you feel drained is not a personal flaw. It is evidence that the system you're using to push yourself forward is fundamentally misaligned with how humans actually function. Chapter 3. The Inner Scoreboard. At some point, comparison stops being something you do and becomes something you live inside. It no longer requires a trigger. No one needs to say anything. No post needs to appear. The scoreboard is already running in the background. It updates automatically. Every thought, every pause, every decision is quietly checked against an invisible list of standards. Where should you be by now? How far ahead others seem? How far behind you feel? This is the inner scoreboard, and once it is installed, it rarely turns itself off. The inner scoreboard is not logical, but it feels convincing. It presents itself as realism. It tells you it is simply observing facts. But it is not neutral. It is selective. It notices certain data points and ignores others. It highlights gaps and minimizes context. It does not ask whether the comparison makes sense. It only asks where you rank. And ranking is emotionally expensive. This scoreboard forms gradually. It starts externally. Grades, praise, criticism, social feedback. Then it moves inward. You internalize the measuring system and begin to apply it to yourself automatically. You do not need an authority figure anymore. You become both the performer and the judge. This is why comparison feels inescapable. You are carrying the evaluator with you. Once the scoreboard is active, your mind begins to organize reality around it. You notice other people's milestones more than your own. You register announcements, achievements, visible progress, engagements, promotions, launches, consistency streaks. Each one becomes a data point. You rarely consciously decide to compare. The comparison happens instantly, before thought, and the emotional response follows just as quickly. A slight drop in mood, a tightening in the chest, a familiar sense of falling behind. What makes the inner scoreboard particularly draining is that it has no fixed rules. The criteria change constantly. One day it is productivity. Another day it is balance. One moment it is confidence. The next it is humility. You are measured against different people in different domains all at once. Someone is more disciplined. Someone is more relaxed. Someone is more successful. Someone is more present. The scoreboard does not care that these qualities may contradict each other. It simply records deficits. This creates a state of chronic self-surveillance. You're always partially watching yourself from the outside, monitoring how you appear, how you compare, whether you are enough. This splits attention. Part of you is living. Part of you is evaluating the life being lived. Over time, this reduces immersion. You're rarely fully present because presence requires safety, and evaluation signals risk. The inner scoreboard also distorts memory. You remember your missteps more vividly than your progress. You replay moments where you felt behind or inadequate. Your brain treats these moments as important data because the scoreboard frames them as warnings. Successes, on the other hand, are quickly normalized. They are either dismissed as luck or reframed as insufficient. This creates a biased internal narrative where effort is invisible and failure feels central. Another consequence is that the scoreboard trains you to relate to others as reference points rather than as people. Even without intention, you begin to scan. Who is ahead? Who is behind? Who makes you feel worse? Who makes you feel temporarily better? This affects relationships subtly. You may feel distance from people who trigger comparison. You may feel relief around those who do not. This is not cruelty. It is self-protection in a system that constantly evaluates. The most exhausting aspect is that the scoreboard never registers completion. You can check every box and still feel unfinished because the metric is not internal satisfaction but relative position. There is no finish line in a relative system. Even if you move up, the field moves with you. Someone new enters the frame, someone else accelerates. The scoreboard refreshes, and the sense of insufficiency returns. Living with an inner scoreboard creates a specific emotional climate. It is not despair, it is tension, a sense of needing to justify your existence through progress. You feel pressure to explain pauses, to defend rest, to rationalize your pace, even to yourself. You stop trusting that being where you are is acceptable. This erodes self-trust quietly over time. Many people assume that removing the scoreboard would lead to stagnation, that without constant measurement, they would lose direction. In reality, the opposite is often true. The scoreboard does not provide direction. It provides comparison. Direction comes from values, interests, constraints, and capacity. The scoreboard ignores all of these. It applies the same measuring stick to radically different lives. The reason the inner scoreboard feels so real is because it mimics objectivity, numbers, timelines, visible markers. But what it measures is incomplete and distorted. It reduces complex human lives to snapshots. It flattens context. It treats different starting points as irrelevant. And yet, because it feels factual, people rarely challenge it. They assume the discomfort it creates is deserved. Recognizing the scoreboard is the first step toward loosening its grip, not fighting it, not silencing it, simply seeing it as a system, not as truth. A mental framework that was learned, reinforced, and can be unlearned. The scoreboard is not who you are. It is a lens you are looking through. In the next chapter, we will look at how this internal measuring system directly impacts self-esteem and why constant comparison almost inevitably lowers it, regardless of how much you achieve. For now, notice the scoreboard. Notice when your mind shifts from experience to evaluation, not to stop it yet, but to understand the mechanism. Awareness does not remove the scoreboard immediately, but it begins to weaken the illusion that it is an accurate judge of your worth. Chapter 4. Why self-esteem drops. Self-esteem rarely collapses all at once. It erodes, quietly, gradually, through thousands of small internal moments that never look dramatic on the outside. Most people assume self-esteem drops because of failure, rejection, or not achieving enough. But many people who struggle with low self-esteem are not failing in any obvious way. They are functioning, progressing, sometimes even excelling. What pulls self-esteem down is not lack of success, but the way success is evaluated inside a comparison-based system. When you live with an inner scoreboard, your sense of worth becomes conditional. It depends on how you are doing relative to others, not relative to your own circumstances, values, or capacity. This creates instability. Some days you feel okay, even confident, because the comparisons seem favorable. Other days, a single trigger can undo that sense of adequacy. Someone else's progress becomes evidence against you. Your worth rises and falls with external reference points. This is not self-esteem, it is self-rating. True self-esteem is relatively stable. It allows for mistakes without total self-collapse. Comparison-based esteem is fragile. It cannot tolerate being outperformed because being outperformed feels like being devalued. The system confuses position with worth. When someone else moves ahead, your mind interprets it as proof that you are less. This interpretation may feel automatic, but it is learned. One of the reasons comparison damages self-esteem so effectively is that it constantly shifts the standard. You are never allowed to internalize success. The moment you reach a level you once wanted, the benchmark moves. You adjust your expectations upward without conscious consent. What was once impressive becomes normal. What was once enough becomes insufficient. This prevents the internal accumulation of competence, which is essential for stable self-esteem. Self-esteem grows when effort, progress, and recovery are acknowledged internally. Comparison interrupts this process. It redirects attention outward at the moment when internal recognition should occur. You finish something, but instead of registering completion, your mind checks how it compares. The satisfaction window closes before it fully opens. Over time, this trains your system not to feel proud, even when pride would be appropriate. Another mechanism is the way comparison collapses complexity. Your life is multifaceted. You're balancing responsibilities, emotional labor, limitations, and invisible work. Comparison ignores all of this. It compresses reality into a single dimension and asks whether you are winning or losing. When you consistently measure a complex system with a simplistic metric, the result is chronic underperformance by definition. No human can excel in all domains at once, yet the comparison system quietly demands exactly that. This leads to internalized inadequacy. You do not just think you are behind, you begin to feel defective. The language in your head shifts from situational to personal. Not, I am tired, but I am weak. Not, this is a slow season, but I am bad at consistency. These identity level conclusions are devastating for self esteem. They turn temporary states into permanent traits. Self comparison also trains you to distrust your own perception. If you feel satisfied, the scoreboard tells you to check whether that satisfaction is justified. If you feel calm, it asks whether you have earned it. If you feel confident, it searches for evidence that you are overestimating yourself. This creates a constant second guessing of your inner experience. When you cannot trust your own sense of adequacy, self esteem has no stable ground to rest on. Another subtle effect is anticipatory self criticism. You begin to preemptively judge yourself before others can. This feels like protection, but it is corrosive. By criticizing yourself first, you attempt to soften potential external judgment. In reality, you internalize the critic and give it full access. Over time, the internal voice becomes harsher than anything most people would say to you. Living with this voice drains emotional resources and reinforces low self-esteem. Comparison also changes how you interpret rest. Instead of seeing rest as recovery, you see it as falling behind. Instead of feeling replenished, you feel guilty. This creates a paradox where you need rest to function well, but resting makes you feel worse about yourself. Chronic guilt attached to rest accelerates emotional exhaustion and further undermines self-worth. Importantly, self-esteem does not drop because you are comparing yourself to exceptional people. It drops because you are comparing yourself at all. Even if the comparisons are mostly favorable, the system remains unstable. You learn that worth is something to be proven repeatedly, not something you possess. This belief keeps you in a state of quiet insecurity, always one comparison away from self-doubt. Many people respond to low self-esteem by trying to improve themselves more aggressively. More self-work, more goals, more pressure. But if the underlying evaluation system remains the same, improvement does not fix the problem. You may achieve more and still feel inadequate because the criteria for adequacy are externally defined and constantly shifting. Understanding why self-esteem drops in comparison mode is not about blaming yourself for thinking the wrong way. This system is learned, reinforced by culture, and rarely questioned. The important realization is that the problem is structural, not personal. You're not failing to feel confident. You're operating inside a framework that makes stable self-esteem nearly impossible. In the next chapter, we will examine how comparison and self-esteem interact to create a closed loop of self-criticism and exhaustion, and why this loop is so difficult to break once it becomes habitual. For now, notice how often your sense of worth changes in response to external cues. That fluctuation is not a reflection of your actual value. It is a signal that your inner measurement system is misaligned. Chapter 5. The Self-Criticism Loop. At some point, comparison stops producing clear thoughts and starts producing a feeling, a low-level heaviness, a background dissatisfaction with yourself that does not go away, even on good days. This is where comparison turns into a loop, not a conscious decision, not a deliberate habit, but an automatic cycle that runs in the background and slowly drains emotional energy. The self-criticism loop does not require constant failure to stay active. It only requires constant evaluation. The loop usually begins with a comparison, but by the time you feel its effects, the comparison itself is often invisible. You just feel worse, less capable, less motivated, less clear. The mind then looks for an explanation for this feeling and lands on the most familiar conclusion. There must be something wrong with you. This is how self-criticism becomes the default response to discomfort. Once self-criticism enters, it reshapes interpretation. Fatigue becomes evidence of weakness. Slowness becomes laziness. Uncertainty becomes incompetence. Normal human fluctuations are reframed as character flaws. This internal framing is not neutral. It activates shame, and shame is one of the most energy-consuming emotional states a human nervous system can experience. Shame collapses complexity into identity. Instead of seeing a moment, you see yourself. Instead of a problem, you see a flaw. When the loop is active, everything feels personal. Mistakes are not events to learn from, they are proof. Proof that you are behind, incapable, or fundamentally lacking. The body responds accordingly. Energy drops, initiative weakens, movement feels heavy. This is where many people misunderstand their own behavior. They notice that after self-criticism, they feel less motivated, more avoidant, more tired. They assume the criticism is accurate. They think, if I feel this bad, I must really be failing. In reality, the sequence is reversed. You do not feel bad because you are failing. You feel unable to act because the self-criticism has already depleted your system. The loop tightens when decreased energy leads to reduced action. You delay tasks, you avoid decisions. You rest without fully resting because guilt is present. The mind then uses this reduced output as further evidence against you. See, you are not doing enough. See, you cannot follow through. The loop closes, reinforcing itself. What makes the self-criticism loop particularly powerful is that it feels productive. It feels like accountability. It feels like being honest with yourself. Many people believe that without a harsh inner voice, they would become careless or complacent. But harshness does not create accountability. It creates fear, and fear-based systems require constant pressure to maintain movement. Another reason the loop persists is that it gives the mind a sense of control. If the problem is you, then theoretically you can fix it. This is more comforting than accepting uncertainty or structural limitations. Self-blame offers the illusion of agency, but it is a false agency. It does not lead to effective change, it leads to emotional contraction. Over time, the loop becomes the lens through which you experience your life. Even neutral moments are scanned for flaws. Even successes are dissected for weaknesses. You rarely experience clean satisfaction because the critic is always present, ready to point out what could have been better. This constant internal commentary prevents emotional recovery. There is no off switch. The body experiences this as chronic stress, not acute panic, but ongoing tension. Muscles remain slightly tight, breathing becomes shallow, sleep is less restorative. You wake up tired not because you did too much, but because your system never fully stood down. Living under continuous self-criticism keeps the nervous system in a semi-activated state. Importantly, the self-criticism loop is not a sign of high standards. High standards can exist without contempt. The loop is a sign of misdirected evaluation. You're trying to motivate a system that needs safety, clarity, and permission to move at its own pace. Instead, it is being monitored, judged, and corrected constantly. No organism thrives under those conditions. Many people try to break the loop by arguing with the critical thoughts. They replace them with positive affirmations or logical rebuttals. This can help temporarily, but it often fails long-term because the loop is not purely cognitive. It is physiological and emotional. The body has learned that evaluation equals threat. Until that association is addressed, the loop will keep restarting. Another common response is avoidance. You distract yourself, you scroll, you numb, you postpone. This provides short-term relief, but strengthens the loop in the long run, because avoidance becomes another item on the scoreboard, another reason to criticize yourself. The loop feeds on both effort and escape. Understanding the self-criticism loop requires removing moral judgment. This is not about being too sensitive or not strong enough. It is about how human systems respond to constant negative evaluation. The loop is a predictable outcome, not a personal failure. Once you see it as a system, you can stop identifying with it. The goal is not to eliminate self-reflection. Reflection is useful. The goal is to interrupt the automatic progression from comparison to criticism to paralysis. This requires a different internal posture, one that does not equate evaluation with worth. We will explore this shift in the next chapters. For now, notice the loop. Notice how often feeling tired turns into self-blame. Notice how quickly reduced energy is interpreted as a personal flaw. The awareness itself creates a small gap, and in that gap, the loop begins to loosen. Chapter 6. The Energy Leak. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that does not come from effort, stress, or lack of sleep. It feels quieter than burnout and heavier than boredom. You can rest and still feel drained. You can simplify your life and still feel low on energy. This exhaustion often confuses people because it does not match their workload. The tasks are manageable. The responsibilities are familiar. And yet something feels off. Energy keeps leaking, and no amount of optimization seems to fix it. This is the cost of constant self-comparison made visible. Energy is not only spent on actions, it is spent on internal processes. Every time your mind evaluates, judges, corrects, or defends you, energy is consumed. When these processes happen occasionally, the system recovers. When they happen continuously, the cost becomes chronic. Self-comparison creates one of the most persistent energy leaks because it never fully resolves. There is no conclusion, no closure, no final verdict. The mind keeps the case open. A large portion of this energy leak comes from mental simulation. You are not just living your life. You're constantly imagining alternative versions of it. Who you could be if you were faster. What you should have achieved by now. How things would look if you had made different choices. These imagined realities are not neutral daydreams. They are evaluative. They exist to measure the gap between what is and what you think should be. Maintaining these parallel mental worlds requires cognitive effort, even if you are not consciously aware of it. Another source of leakage is emotional suppression. When comparison triggers feelings like envy, disappointment, or grief over lost time, many people push those feelings down. They label them as unproductive or immature. But suppressed emotion does not disappear. It stays active in the system, requiring energy to keep it contained. This creates a background drain that people often misinterpret as low motivation or lack of willpower. There is also the cost of self-monitoring. When you live with an inner scoreboard, part of your attention is always turned inward, checking performance. Am I doing enough? Am I falling behind? Should I be further? This internal surveillance consumes attentional resources. Attention is finite. The more of it is spent on monitoring, the less is available for focus, creativity, and presence. You may notice that even simple tasks feel mentally tiring. This is not because the tasks are difficult, but because your attention is fragmented. Comparison also creates energy loss through indecision. When you are oriented toward others' trajectories, your own choices feel less grounded. You second-guess decisions. You hesitate. You wait for clarity that never comes. Each delayed decision holds mental space. Open loops accumulate. The brain expends energy maintaining unresolved options. Over time, this leads to decision fatigue, even if you are not making many decisions at all. One of the most underestimated drains is the emotional labor of self-justification. When you feel behind, you often feel the need to explain yourself. Sometimes out loud, often internally. You rehearse reasons for your pace. You build arguments for why your situation is different. Even if no one is asking, the internal defense is active. Defending your existence against an imagined judge is exhausting. It keeps you in a posture of apology toward your own life. Comparison also interferes with recovery. Rest is not just the absence of activity, it is the absence of evaluation. If you rest while mentally tracking how much you should be doing, your nervous system does not register recovery. You may lie down, but your system stays alert. This is why people can take breaks and still feel tired. The body did not receive the signal that it was safe to power down. Another major leak comes from emotional friction. When part of you wants to slow down and another part demands acceleration, energy is lost in internal conflict. You feel pulled in opposite directions. Even when you choose one path, the other part remains active, criticizing or doubting the choice. This internal tug of war consumes energy without producing movement. It is pure friction. Importantly, this energy leak is not dramatic. It does not feel like panic or overwhelm. It feels like dull depletion, like operating on low battery all the time. This is why people often blame themselves. They assume they are weak, unmotivated, or undisciplined. In reality, they are leaking energy through constant internal processes that were never designed to run continuously. Many people try to fix low energy by adding stimulation. More caffeine, more content, more input. This often makes the problem worse. Stimulation adds load to an already taxed system. What the system actually needs is reduction. Fewer internal processes, less evaluation, less mental noise. Energy returns when leaks are sealed, not when pressure increases. It is also important to understand that energy leaks are cumulative. Each comparison may seem small. Each self-critical thought may seem insignificant. But over time, they add up. The system never fully recharges. You begin each day slightly depleted. This baseline deficit becomes normal. You forget what it feels like to have surplus energy. You assume this is just how life feels. One of the most damaging beliefs people hold is that they must earn rest, ease, or satisfaction by reaching a certain level. Comparison keeps that level perpetually out of reach. As a result, the system stays in a state of postponed relief. Always almost there, always not quite enough. Living in postponed relief is one of the fastest ways to drain life energy. Sealing the energy leak does not require eliminating ambition or goals. It requires removing unnecessary internal costs. It means questioning processes that feel normal but are actually optional. Constant self-measurement is not a requirement for growth. It is a habit reinforced by culture and technology. And like any habit, it consumes resources. In the next chapter, we will address one of the beliefs that keeps this energy leak active, the idea that there is a normal or correct timeline you are failing to meet. This belief fuels comparison and makes rest feel dangerous. Understanding why this timeline is largely a myth is a critical step toward reclaiming your energy. For now, notice where your energy goes. Not just what you do, but what you carry. Notice how much effort is spent on thinking about your life rather than living it. Energy does not disappear without reason. If you feel consistently drained, something is drawing from your system. And very often, that something is not your workload, but the constant internal cost of measuring yourself against lives that were never meant to be your standard. Chapter 7. The Myth of Normal Progress. One of the strongest forces keeping comparison alive is the belief that there is a normal timeline you are supposed to follow. A quiet assumption that by a certain age, stage, or point in life, certain things should already be in place. Stability, clarity, confidence, success. When your life does not match this imagined schedule, the inner scoreboard interprets it as delay or failure. But the idea of normal progress is largely a myth, and believing in it is one of the most reliable ways to stay dissatisfied. The human mind is deeply uncomfortable with randomness. It prefers order, patterns, predictable sequences. Timelines offer that comfort. They suggest that if you do the right things in the right order, life will unfold smoothly. But real lives do not develop linearly. They expand, contract, stall, accelerate, and change direction. Progress is uneven by nature. The problem is not that your life is irregular. The problem is that you are measuring it against a fictional standard of regularity. What we call normal progress is usually a collage of selective stories. We see people at visible moments of coherence and assume continuity. We rarely see the pauses, detours, regressions, or invisible labor that preceded those moments. We compress years into snapshots and treat those snapshots as evidence of steady advancement. When you compare your lived moment by moment reality to these compressed narratives, your life will always appear messier, slower, and less impressive. This myth is reinforced by institutions, social expectations, and digital platforms. Education suggests a sequence. Careers are framed as ladders. Social media highlights milestones. Even self-help culture often implies that clarity follows effort quickly and predictably. These frameworks create the impression that deviation equals dysfunction, that if you are not moving forward visibly, you are doing something wrong. This belief quietly turns natural pauses into sources of shame. In reality, many forms of growth are invisible while they are happening. Emotional maturation, recovery, learning boundaries, rebuilding trust in yourself, adapting to new constraints. These processes rarely produce immediate external markers. They slow visible progress while increasing internal capacity. Comparison-based timelines do not recognize this kind of work. They only count outcomes. As a result, people doing deep internal restructuring often feel like they are falling behind, when in fact, they are laying foundations. Another distortion comes from ignoring starting points. People begin from radically different conditions, different levels of support, different health baselines, different responsibilities, different forms of early stability or instability. Comparing timelines without accounting for starting points is not just unfair, it is meaningless. Yet the inner scoreboard does exactly that. It treats all trajectories as comparable and then draws conclusions about worth. The belief in normal progress also collapses seasons. Life has phases where output is high and phases where consolidation is necessary. Periods of acceleration are often followed by periods of rest or recalibration. Comparison-based timelines reject this rhythm. They demand constant forward motion. When your system naturally slows down, the scoreboard interprets it as regression. This creates pressure to override signals that are actually protective. One of the most damaging effects of this myth is how it turns uncertainty into failure. Not knowing what comes next becomes a problem to fix rather than a phase to move through. You rush decisions, you force clarity, you choose paths prematurely just to escape the discomfort of feeling behind. This often leads to misalignment, which later requires correction. The attempt to stay on a normal timeline ironically creates more disruption. The myth also prevents integration. When you are focused on where you should be, you miss where you are. You overlook skills gained, resilience built, insights earned. These do not register as progress because they are not easily comparable. Over time, this creates a narrative of stagnation that does not match reality. You feel stuck not because you are not moving, but because the movement you are making is not being counted. Letting go of the idea of normal progress does not mean giving up direction. It means replacing external timelines with internal coherence. Progress becomes about alignment rather than speed, about sustainability rather than appearance. This shift immediately reduces pressure because it removes an impossible standard. There is no universal schedule you are failing to meet. There's only your life, unfolding under specific conditions. Many people fear that without a normal timeline, anything goes, that they will drift, stagnate, or settle. But direction does not come from timelines. It comes from values, constraints, and capacity. When you stop forcing yourself into borrowed schedules, you can make decisions based on what is actually possible and meaningful now. This creates cleaner movement, even if it looks slower from the outside. Recognizing the myth of normal progress is often a turning point. It loosens the grip of comparison and makes space for self-trust to return. You stop asking why you are not there yet and start asking what this phase is for. That question changes everything. In the next chapter, we will look at practical ways to exit comparison mode without denial or forced positivity, not by pretending others do not exist, but by changing how your system relates to information about them. For now, consider this. If your life feels off timeline, it may not be because you are late. It may be because you are living a life that does not fit into a simplified narrative of progress. And that does not make it wrong. Chapter 8. How to exit comparison mode. Exiting comparison mode does not mean becoming indifferent to others or pretending you live in isolation. Comparison is a natural cognitive function. The problem is not that your mind notices differences. The problem is that those differences are automatically converted into judgments about your worth, your pace, and your adequacy. Leaving comparison mode is not about stopping perception. It is about changing the internal response that follows perception. The first shift is understanding that comparison mode is a state, not a truth. When you are in it, everything feels evaluative. Neutral information turns into evidence. Other people's lives feel like commentary on yours. But this is not an accurate reading of reality. It is a temporary configuration of attention and interpretation. When the system is stressed, tired, or overstimulated, it defaults to comparison because comparison promises orientation. It tells you where you stand. Unfortunately, it does so at a high internal cost. One practical exit is moving from evaluation to observation. Evaluation asks, is this better or worse than me? Observation asks, what is actually happening here? This sounds simple, but it requires a deliberate internal pause. When you notice yourself tightening after seeing someone else's progress, instead of following the automatic judgment, you name the fact. This person is at a different point. This is a visible outcome. I do not know the full context. These statements are not affirmations. They are reality checks. They interrupt the reflex to turn difference into deficit. Another critical shift is changing the reference point. Comparison mode uses external reference points by default. Exiting it requires reinstalling an internal one. This does not mean inventing arbitrary self-love statements. It means grounding progress in personal constraints and capacity. Instead of asking, am I doing as much as they are? You ask, am I operating near my current capacity? This question immediately changes the answer space. Capacity fluctuates. It is affected by health, emotional load, responsibility, and season. Measuring yourself against capacity rather than others creates accuracy, and accuracy reduces shame. Language plays a larger role than most people realize. Comparison mode relies on global absolute statements. I'm behind. I'm bad at this. I should be further. Exiting the mode requires narrowing language. You replace global conclusions with specific descriptions. This part feels slower. This task is taking more energy than expected. This is a low-capacity phase. Precision removes moral weight. When a situation is described accurately, it becomes workable rather than overwhelming. Another practical exit is reducing exposure without total avoidance. You do not need to disappear from social platforms, but you do need to notice which inputs consistently activate the scoreboard. Comparison is context-sensitive. Certain people, content types, or times of day are more triggering. Adjusting exposure is not weakness. It is system management. You're not avoiding reality. You're choosing not to overload your nervous system with unnecessary evaluation cues. One of the most effective exits is replacing ranking with sequencing. Comparison asks, who is ahead? Sequencing asks, what comes next for me? Ranking freezes you in relation to others. Sequencing returns attention to action. Even small, concrete next steps pull energy back into the present. The system relaxes when it knows what to do next. Uncertainty fuels comparison. Clarity, even partial, quiets it. It is also important to redefine what counts as progress. Comparison mode only counts visible outcomes. Exiting it requires expanding the definition. Rest that restores function is progress. Learning boundaries is progress. Stabilizing after disruption is progress. Saying no to misaligned opportunities is progress. When these forms of movement are recognized internally, the system no longer needs external validation to feel legitimate. Another key shift is allowing others' success to exist without reference. This does not happen through force. It happens through repetition. Each time you notice someone else's progress and choose not to apply it to your worth, you weaken the old association. You do not need to feel inspired. Neutrality is enough. Indifference is not the goal. Non-self-referential awareness is. Many people struggle to exit comparison mode because they fear losing ambition. They worry that without pressure, they will stop moving. In reality, what often returns is cleaner motivation. When the threat response quiets, curiosity comes back online. Interest replaces urgency. You begin to move because something matters, not because you are trying to escape inadequacy. This kind of movement is slower to start, but easier to sustain. It is also necessary to address the emotional residue comparison leaves behind. You cannot think your way out of a state your body is still holding. When comparison has been chronic, the nervous system remains alert even after the thought stops. Gentle grounding practices, slower pacing, and permission to be where you are help the body register safety. When safety increases, the mind stops scanning for relative position. Exiting comparison mode is not a one-time decision. It is a repeated choice. Some days, the scoreboard will be loud. On those days, the goal is not to eliminate it, but to not obey it. You notice the ranking impulse and choose not to act from it. Over time, this builds a new internal habit. The mind learns that not every difference requires a verdict. The deeper shift happens when you stop using yourself as a project to fix and start relating to yourself as a system to support. Systems do not respond well to criticism. They respond to calibration. When you treat your pace, energy, and limits as data rather than flaws, comparison loses its grip. There's nothing to defend because nothing is on trial. In the next chapter, we will focus on rebuilding self-trust after long periods of comparison. Because leaving comparison mode is not just about stopping a habit. It is about restoring a relationship with yourself that was gradually replaced by monitoring and judgment. Without that repair, the scoreboard will always find a way back in. Chapter 9. Rebuilding Self-Trust. When you have lived in comparison mode for a long time, self-trust does not disappear dramatically. It thins out. It becomes quiet, hesitant, unreliable. You stop fully believing your own signals. You second-guess decisions that once felt obvious. You look outward for confirmation before allowing yourself to feel settled. This loss of self-trust is not a personality flaw. It is a predictable consequence of outsourcing your internal authority to external reference points. Self-trust is not confidence. Confidence is situational. It rises and falls with outcomes. Self-trust is relational. It is the sense that you can listen to yourself and respond appropriately, even when things are unclear. Comparison weakens this relationship by constantly overriding your internal signals with external metrics. Over time, you learn that how you feel is less important than how you measure up. When this happens repeatedly, your system adapts by lowering the volume on your own voice. Rebuilding self-trust does not start with bold decisions or radical change. It starts with small acts of internal agreement, moments where you notice what you need and respond without justification. Resting when you are tired without explaining why. Slowing down without narrating excuses. Choosing what feels aligned, even if it does not look impressive. These moments may feel uncomfortable at first, because comparison trained you to distrust them. But discomfort is not a sign of error. It is a sign of recalibration. One of the first steps in rebuilding self-trust is allowing your internal signals to be data rather than verdicts. Fatigue is information. Resistance is information. Interest is information. They are not commands, and they are not moral statements. When you stop arguing with these signals, they become clearer. When you stop punishing yourself for having limits, your system becomes more cooperative. Trust grows when you respond to reality rather than fight it. Another important shift is separating pace from worth. Comparison ties speed to value. Faster feels better. Slower feels wrong. Rebuilding self-trust requires untangling this association. Your pace is not a character assessment. It is an outcome of capacity, context, and season. When you allow yourself to move at a pace that your system can sustain, you send a powerful signal internally: I am allowed to exist as I am. That signal restores safety. Safety restores trust. Decision-making is often where lack of self-trust becomes most visible. You hesitate. You seek reassurance. You replay options endlessly. This is not because you are incapable of choosing. It is because you no longer believe your choices are valid unless they align with an external standard. Rebuilding trust here means allowing decisions to be provisional. You choose, not because it is perfect, but because it is reasonable, given what you know now. You trust that future adjustments are allowed. Trust grows when you experience yourself as responsive rather than rigid. Another layer of rebuilding self-trust involves redefining mistakes. In comparison mode, mistakes are evidence. They confirm inadequacy. In a trust-based system, mistakes are feedback. They inform adjustment. This reframing changes how your body responds to risk. When mistakes are not equated with failure of self, experimentation becomes safer. You act more. You learn faster. You recover quicker. Trust is reinforced through experience, not affirmation. It is also essential to rebuild trust in your perception of effort. Comparison distorts effort by hiding others' inputs. You begin to believe that your effort is inefficient or excessive. Rebuilding trust means acknowledging what things actually cost you: emotional labor, caregiving, recovery, adaptation. When effort is seen accurately, self-respect returns. You stop demanding output without accounting for input. This creates a fairer internal contract. Another practical way to rebuild self-trust is to keep promises small and realistic. Comparison pushes people toward overcommitment, big plans, unrealistic standards. These promises are often broken, not because of lack of integrity, but because they exceed capacity. Each broken promise weakens trust. Rebuilding requires the opposite approach. Make smaller commitments. Fulfill them consistently. Let your system experience reliability again. Trust grows through repetition, not intensity. You may also need to grieve the time spent distrusting yourself. This is often overlooked. There may be sadness about choices delayed, paths abandoned, energy wasted on self-doubt. This grief does not mean you did something wrong. It means you are recognizing what comparison cost you. Allowing this grief to exist without rushing past it is part of the repair. Trust deepens when the system feels acknowledged rather than dismissed. Rebuilding self-trust also involves changing how you relate to uncertainty. Comparison treats uncertainty as failure. Trust treats uncertainty as normal. When you allow yourself not to know without self-judgment, your nervous system relaxes. Curiosity replaces urgency. You begin to explore rather than prove. This shift is subtle but powerful. It marks the transition from evaluation to engagement. It is important to understand that self-trust does not mean never looking at others or never learning externally. It means external information no longer overrides your internal sense of timing and relevance. You can observe without collapsing. You can learn without self-erasure. This balance is what makes trust durable. There will be days when comparison returns strongly. On those days, self-trust looks like not abandoning yourself. You notice the urge to measure, and instead of obeying it, you choose a smaller, kinder response. You slow down. You narrow focus. You return to what is actually in front of you. Each time you do this, you reinforce the relationship you are rebuilding. By the time self-trust begins to return, many people notice something unexpected. They are not less ambitious. They are clearer. Their energy is steadier. Their movement is quieter but more consistent. They stop needing to justify their existence through output. They begin to live from internal permission rather than external pressure. In the final chapter, we will look at what life looks like when the scoreboard no longer runs the system. Not a perfect life, not a pressure-free life, but a life where energy is not constantly siphoned off by comparison. A life where movement comes from alignment and rest does not require explanation. Chapter 10. Living without the scoreboard. Living without the scoreboard does not mean life becomes effortless, slow, or passive. It means effort finally goes where it matters. When the internal measuring system loosens its grip, a surprising amount of energy becomes available. Not explosive energy, not manic productivity, but steady, usable energy. The kind that allows you to show up consistently without forcing yourself. Without the scoreboard, your attention returns to the present moment. You are no longer constantly checking where you stand. You notice what you are actually doing, how it feels, and what it requires. This shift alone changes the texture of daily life. Tasks feel simpler, not because they are easier, but because there is less internal interference. You do one thing at a time instead of doing one thing while judging it. Movement without the scoreboard feels quieter. There is less urgency, less inner narration, less need to announce progress to yourself or others. You act because something makes sense now, not because you are trying to close a gap. This kind of movement may look slower from the outside, but it compounds. You are not constantly stopping to recover from self-inflicted pressure. You conserve energy by not fighting yourself. One of the most noticeable changes is how rest feels. Rest stops being something you justify or optimize. It becomes a functional part of living. When the scoreboard is gone, rest actually restores you because the nervous system is no longer on alert. You can stop without mentally calculating what it costs you in status or progress. The body recognizes safety, and recovery happens more fully. Living without the scoreboard also changes how you experience others. Their success no longer automatically translates into information about you. You can notice without contracting. You can appreciate without comparison. Sometimes you may even feel genuine curiosity instead of threat. This does not mean comparison never appears. It means it no longer dictates your internal state. Your sense of identity also stabilizes. Without constant ranking, you stop defining yourself by position. You become less reactive to external signals. Praise feels pleasant, but not necessary. Criticism feels informative, but not devastating. You begin to experience yourself as a continuous person rather than a fluctuating score. Decisions become simpler. Not easier, but cleaner. You are no longer trying to choose the option that looks best relative to others. You choose what fits your current reality. This reduces regret. Even when outcomes are imperfect, you trust the decision because it was made from available information and internal coherence. Trust replaces second guessing. Another change is how progress feels. Progress without the scoreboard does not announce itself loudly. It feels like increased ease, less resistance, shorter recovery times. You notice that you start things more readily and abandon them less often. You do not need constant motivation because you are no longer pushing against internal judgment. Momentum becomes a byproduct rather than a goal. Living this way also makes space for grief and honesty. Without the pressure to perform adequacy, you can acknowledge loss, disappointment, and fatigue without turning them into character assessments. You allow yourself to be human without narrating failure. This emotional honesty paradoxically increases resilience. What is acknowledged can move. What is judged stays stuck. Importantly, life without the scoreboard is not about lowering standards. It is about changing what standards are applied to. Instead of measuring worth, you measure alignment. Instead of ranking outcomes, you assess sustainability. Instead of asking whether something is impressive, you ask whether it is workable. These questions lead to better decisions and longer-term stability. You may notice that your relationship with time changes. There is less sense of being late, less urgency to catch up. Time becomes something you move through rather than race against. This does not eliminate ambition. It removes panic. Ambition without panic is far more effective. There will still be challenges. There will still be effort, frustration, and uncertainty. Living without the scoreboard does not remove difficulty. It removes unnecessary suffering. You stop adding a second layer of pain through constant self-evaluation. You deal with what is actually happening instead of what it supposedly means about you. Eventually, you may realize that much of what you thought was wrong with you was simply the result of living under evaluation for too long. The tiredness, the self-doubt, the sense of being behind. These were not traits. They were symptoms. When the scoreboard quiets, those symptoms soften. Not overnight, but steadily. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a return to a way of moving through life that is less performative and more grounded. You stop trying to prove your existence and start inhabiting it. You stop asking whether you are enough and start asking what is needed now. If there is one thing to carry forward, it is this. Your life does not need to be measured to be valid. You do not need to be ahead to be worthy. You do not need to be optimal to be allowed rest, clarity, or peace. When you step out of the scoreboard, you do not disappear. You finally arrive. This is not the end of comparison forever. It is the end of comparison as the authority. And that change, more than any strategy or mindset shift, is what gives your energy back to you.